Our next speaker is one of my favorite people on the internet, a senior software engineer at Google, currently working on the Angular framework team, living in the Boston area, originally from Wisconsin, has a reputation for puns, which are on display on a few of the Angular YouTube channel videos. She's also a photographer, member of the Star Wars Droid Builders Club, not fluent in Klingon, so please stop asking, Kevin. And you can find her on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and Threads. Please welcome to the stage, Jessica Janiuk.
Hello there. My name is Jessica Janiuk. I'm a senior software engineer on the Angular framework team at Google. And if you don't know who I am or haven't watched any of the YouTube videos, I've been on the Angular team for about 3 years. I've been at Google for about 4 years. And I've been an engineer for about 15, or give or take. I build Star Wars robots for fun. I cosplay. I'm a historical fencer, a photographer. I live in Boston, and I like puns. So that's a bit about me. It's worth pointing out that I don't speak for Google. My words here are my own. So with that, this talk is Angular Momentum, web frameworks, server-side rendering, hydration, and beyond. So you're probably thinking, well, Jessica, you said you're on the Angular framework team, and I don't use Angular. So are you going to talk about Angular this whole time, and I'm not going to know anything about this and not care and be bored? Well, rest assured, that's not the case. We're not going to be talking entirely about Angular while we're here. So here's a quick overview of what we will be talking about. Angular, 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 Angular. I'm kidding. Or am I? I am, though. So what I'm actually going to talk about is a little bit of Angular's current renaissance that we're in. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the new features there, very, very briefly. But really what we're going to talk about is what I've actually worked on, and then use that as kind of a framing for what it's like to work as a framework author. And then a little bit of future-looking stuff. So, Angular's renaissance. And I have to point out, that word is really tough to spell. Every time, I'm like, is it 2 N's and 1 S? Is it 2 N's and 2 S? And every time I have to rely on spell check, I think I'm going to get it right, and then I don't. Does this happen to anybody else? Yeah? Okay, good. I'm not alone. So Angular's been around for 7 years, and that's a long time in internet years. There's been a lot of ebbs and flows that have happened with that. A lot has changed in that time. Angular has evolved. We've seen entire test infrastructure rise and fall. We've replaced our entire internal rendering engine on Angular in that time. We've seen new frameworks pop up all over the place. The internet has changed as a whole. The needs of users have changed. The framework wars happened. And with all of that, like, we're still here, which is pretty cool. And actually, since v13, so about 2 years ago, since we're on a 6-month release cycle, a little over 2 years, we've actually seen a lot of interest rise in Angular, which is super awesome. There was much rejoicing, huzzah. It's obviously because that's around the time I joined the team. Totally not related to anything else and just me. Right, not at all. So Alyssa Nicole has compared the Angular renaissance actually to the real historical renaissance, and I think it's somewhat apt because we are very focused on the Angular team right now about bringing in new ideas and a huge focus on developer experience. So our goal is very similar to the humanist approach that happened during the Renaissance period. It's worth pointing out, though, that none of this is happening in a vacuum, because that would suck. So it may surprise you to hear that we talk very regularly with other framework authors, like Solid, Vue, Svelte, and others. there's actually quite a bit of collaboration that happens across the various frameworks. For example, in this photo, we actually have several Angular team members. So on the left there is Alex Rickabaugh. In the middle is Andrew Kushner. We've got Pavel. I'm not going to try to say his last name because I get it wrong every time. And then on the right there is Ryan Carniato of Solid. And then second from the left is actually Jatin from the Wiz team, which is a framework that's internal to Google. And you may have actually heard of it before, but we actually collaborate with them as well pretty regularly. And then famously, recently, Sarah Drasner joined Google and is the director of all of the web stuff that's happening there. And she was on the Vue team before. So we actually have quite a number of different perspectives happening on the team. In fact, last year, I was on a panel with Ryan, but also Fred Schott, the co-creator of Astro, Zach Leatherman of Eleventy, Alex Chopin with Nuxt. And we were talking about how we can make the web better and how the framework wars really aren't a thing anymore. Beyond that, even at Google, I run an internal summit that happens annually where we actually take our entire department and we break up into small groups and we pick a set of frameworks and we all build the same application with that set of frameworks. And the reason we do this is so that we can gain unique perspectives that we wouldn't have gotten if we were just working on our own stuff. And it's been really well received. We've taken the things that we've learned and we've liked, and we bring them to our own products. And we also take note of the things we don't like. So it's been really useful for us overall. And all of this to say is that we really would not be in this renaissance that Angular is currently in without collaboration. The web framework space is all collaboration. If you want to learn a bit more about how we're kind of all interconnected, you can go to Emma Twersky's talk tomorrow at 11 a.m. where she's going to talk about the front-end family tree. She's a colleague of mine and is wonderful, so you'll really enjoy that talk. Okay, so I said we'd talk about new Angular features briefly, and that's because this isn't intended to be solely about Angular. So here's a few of the things that maybe you've seen in the tech news if you're paying attention and seeing the Angular headlines. So standalone components, hydration and server-side rendering improvements. Signals is big all over the web framework space right now. Deferred loading as a primitive, and our new control flow syntax. So that's kind of the big stuff. There's more stuff that's happening beyond this, but what I actually had direct impact on and worked directly on are these subset of features. So hydration, deferred loading, and the new control flow. So we're going to kind of dig into these features and talk about how we as framework authors have to think through them and the process that we go through when we're developing stuff for something as large as a web framework used by millions and millions of people. So we're going to start by looking at some of the concerns that we have as a framework author. So there's quite a few: developer experience and expectations of those developers, framework constraints, so where the framework is right now, where our limitations are, code health, not just of our own code, but of all of the users' code, the planned directions we have for the framework long term, the public API surface that we're offering people, whether it's too complicated or needs stuff deprecated, the bundle sizes that we're producing, the breakiness. So when a change comes in, we have to assess just how much it's going to break our users. So if someone changes a signature, that can be a big problem. We have to find a way to be able to land it in a way that's going to be friendly to our user base. The incremental adoption factor. So when you release a new feature, not everyone can use it right away. How can you let people slowly opt in and get some of the benefits, even if they can't get all of them yet? The pace of change. So if we move too slowly, people perceive that as stagnation. If we move too fast, people can't keep up. So we have to constantly pay attention to how quickly and how people are receiving where things are. The ecosystem. No framework exists by itself. There are libraries out there dedicated to something in your framework, so you can't break them either. Migrations. This is something that Angular has to deal with very regularly. We have this philosophy of bringing people along with our new changes, so that means we have to write code to change a syntax from one to another. And that takes time. And then A unique constraint that Angular has, because we are a Google framework, is that we have to deal with the fact that Google is our 1P here, and the 3P world is everyone else. And the constraints there are different. We have different tech stacks. There's a famous tech island at Google. We have our mono repo, and there are a lot of challenges associated with that. For example, because Google's a mono repo, we don't actually have multiple versions of Angular inside Google's. Like the whole Semver thing doesn't exist in Google. Everything on Angular in Google runs at head. So if we land code, it has to work. We can't break anybody. So it makes things really, we'll say, fun. So let's talk about hydration. This was a key thing that I worked on. If you are unfamiliar with what hydration is, it's essentially the process by which, when you have a server-side rendered application, once it hits the client, there is a kind of remeshing of the application into the HTML that was rendered out on the server. So you could take the approach that we used to take of just like wiping everything out that was rendered on the server and repainting everything, but that's not ideal. Or you can actually develop hydration processes that don't do that. Here's kind of roughly how it works. So we start off with an annotation step. So when your server is actually rendering your application, it's actually doing extra work for the hydration process to work on the client side when it gets there. It's actually looking at all of your application's components, all of the structures within it. It's taking note of how many root nodes are in your components. It's looking at when you're doing content projection, when you've got control flow, what's going to be present, what kind of like templates are going to exist that may not be existing in the DOM at that point. It takes all that information and then it serializes it. I think I spelled that wrong. But we'll kind of go with it. So all of that information then gets kind of bundled up into a JSON object that gets thrown into the footer of the HTML. There's also some annotations that are added to each DOM node so we can actually reference the information appropriately. All of that's then handed off down to the client. And of course, the browser doesn't know anything about the application. It just sees a bunch of HTML and it goes, great, I've got a page, I've rendered it for you. And then when your application bootstraps, it says, hey, I've got hydration turned on, so please go look at that stuff in the footer, and we'll take that information, and it'll help you know like what's there. Like, look here, you'll see there's this like set of DOM nodes, use those instead of destroying them. That's essentially how hydration works. What's interesting is that Angular was not built with hydration in mind. It's been around a long time, since 2016. And at the time, server-side rendering wasn't really a big thing. So it took a lot of work for us to even get to the place where we actually could do hydration. We actually had an open GitHub issue since 2016 asking for hydration, and it took until this year for us to actually be able to ship it safely. And one of the things that actually made that possible was replacing our rendering engine so that we actually had the instruction set that we could use for this process. So when we're building a feature like this, one of the things we actually go out and ask is, how do other frameworks handle this? So we ask this question a lot, actually. Like, one of the questions was, like, how does React handle DOM mismatches? So if you like change the DOM structure that was rendered on the server before it gets to the client, your client's going to be like, what's this? I don't know what this is. And that's a problem. So we wanted to understand how other frameworks did that. So we spend a lot of time looking at all of the documentation for all the other frameworks out there on how hydration worked, and we used that information to brainstorm. Okay, we've seen how they're doing it. We've seen their public APIs. What would this look like for us? So we start kind of collating a list of ideas that we have. Once we have that brainstorming done, we move on to the prototyping phase. This is the fun part where we get to take all those ideas and like create a branch and start building out all of our concepts to see if it'll even work. Oftentimes there's multiple iterations of these prototypes. So I think for hydration, we had something like 4 different prototypes, each building on top of each other that was improving the algorithm that we were doing for hydration. And then once we actually had something that we felt would work, and we felt confident enough to move forward, we moved on to our next step, which is building a design doc. This is a common step at Google where we spend a bunch of time documenting out the whole research process, all of the different approaches we're going to take, the pros and cons of each, which one we're going to recommend. Here's the actual goals of the project. This happens for every major feature that we do, and even some small features. And it's a lot of writing. This design doc, when printed, is 26 pages long. And that's not including any sub-design docs, which often break out sub-features that we need to think through as well. This doc then gets kind of put up for a loose comment from the teams and some people outside of our team, where we'll get all sorts of people coming in and saying, did you think of this? I don't know if this is going to work. What do you think about this idea? Can we do it this way? Those comments will go into a refinement for us. Sometimes we end up tossing a whole design out because it's just not going to work and we start over, which is unfortunate. It's happened a few times. Then after that, we actually do a more formal review where we review any outstanding items, and then we get sign-offs, and then we actually get to go on to doing the fun part of doing the productionized implementation. So it's a lot of prep work. Then we start thinking about, okay, what's our public API going to look like? How are we going to expose this feature to users? In this case, it was really ideal because it's a one-liner, and it's super not complex, and you can just add it to your application and it just works. I wish all of our features were like this, but the reality is that oftentimes it's a lot more complicated than that. We'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about Defer, but the next step after this, we haven't released yet. We've built out our close to final version. Now we start actually working with early potential candidates of people who can test it with us. So we'll go to our GDEs, our Google Developer Experts, and talk to them about apps that they're using where they'd like to see if hydration would work. We'll go to some close trusted clients, and then we'll hop on calls with them, and we'll walk through and see what errors they're getting, take note of it so we can fix it before it gets to the final release and before the end user sees it. And then after that, we start validating performance. So we'll take some of those example websites, we'll run it through web page tests, we'll see what our actual performance numbers are. And in this case, we were thrilled because it was you can see there's a direct improvement across the board. It's not always the case, but the key one here is that we actually saw a huge improvement of LCP, which was one of the main goals of this whole project to begin with. And then after that, we could finally feel confident in shipping it. So that's a long process. Let's quickly review those steps. That was a lot of steps. And that happened only over 9 months, which may seem like a long time, but it's actually a really short time for a whole process like this to go from start to finish. And it was really important to us that it be incremental, so we're really proud that we were able to make this happen. We actually added a feature for being able to opt components out of hydration if they had some sort of issue with it. That way they could enable hydration and then fix some of those issues later. It's a really important principle for us, is that people can do that. And then it's also a solid, that's the wrong logo, that's the wrong framework. I guess we'll just go with that. So it's a solid foundation to build upon. And that's a really important part of being a framework author as well. We have to think about our future and that we're going to be able to support all the things we want to do. So, deferred loading, not to keep you in suspense. This was a very similar process. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing here, but we did spend similarly a lot of time looking at the different framework implementations across React Solid and Vue and Svelte to see how deferred loading of components was handled within each of those. In this case, the differences between the hydration process, we actually had a 30-plus page design document, so even longer. We had an additional request for comment out on GitHub, so we could actually share what we thought our public API was going to look like, and people who are out in our community could come comment on it. This is a really helpful process for us because it kind of weeds out some of the bad ideas that maybe we had ahead of time and actually gives people buy-in to the feature and gets some excitement there. Additionally, we had to deal with some 1P constraints here because it is different in Google. And it has a much more complicated public API surface than the hydration one. For example, here's what this looks like. We've got a couple of different sections here, and each of the params that are offered in there, all of the trigger functionality, the preload. It's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more documentation for us to write out. But we're really thrilled about it because for us, we felt that we were able to look at all those other versions of the APIs and not only include all of the best of those things, but actually materially improve upon that prior art by adding some things like built-in triggers. And we're thrilled about it, and we're excited that developers will be able to express their intent without having to worry about the things like managing dynamic imports for deferred loading. Funny story, though, the Angular team really likes Svelte syntax. This came out from one of those summits that we ran. Our original design was this, and if you know anything about Svelte, you'll know that that's like template syntax that's pulled directly from Svelte. We actually really liked it. And when we put up that RFC, we actually had this syntax in mind, and we got a ton of feedback that people actually preferred something more akin to Microsoft's Razor syntax. And that was a little challenging because a lot of us were very attached to the Svelte syntax. So we actually went out and did a full-on user study of the two different syntaxes, and it was very clear, 2/3 of people preferred the Razor syntax. So we threw out our preferences and we switched over to the Razor syntax version. So if you don't like Razor syntax, don't at me. But you can curly brace hashtag me. I think that'll work. And just like hydration, this is a really solid foundation to, we already did this joke. And this time Ryan's laughing at us. Anyway, so moving on to control flow. I didn't actually work on the full implementation of control flow, but what I did work on is the migration for it. So the whole concept of bringing our users along with us. And for control flow, it's kind of a bit of a challenge because there's all these nested structures that people will have in their templates, and keeping track of that is a challenge. If you've never used Angular, here's how you would run that migration in the command line. The constraints of migrations are that people do a ton of unexpected things in their code, and you've got to account for all of them. Like I said, nested structures are hard. As you're modifying the template in place, all of those offsets of where the text is shifts, and you've got to accommodate for that offset as you're readjusting the code. It's not fun. Dealing with people's formatting and the cases that are infrequently used. For example, 2 of us on the Angular team didn't realize we had this if-then-else structure. We didn't know, and as we were writing this migration, we're like, wow, today I learned we supported this. So we have to deal with all of that with a migration. Here's an example of the code itself. There's a lot more to it, but these migrations are a big part of why people use Angular, because we don't break people. That's part of our, we do our best not to break people. I can't say that we don't always. So it essentially takes code that looks like this in a template to this, which I think we can all agree is much easier to read. So to kind of summarize the day in the life of a framework engineer, there's a lot of research involved. We do a lot of design docs to the point where I'm kind of tired of writing them, but it's part of my job. A lot of code reviews, both internal and contributor code reviews, a lot of discussions about whether those are okay things to land, whether we can land them within Google, and what's involved there, just making sure we're doing the right thing. A lot of meetings and a lot of collaboration, a lot of writing code eventually. We'll get to that after all of the other work. And then there's the kind of the cherry on top, which is that we get to do these fun conferences and appear on YouTube videos from time to time. So some future-looking stuff. Right now on the team, our focus is essentially developer experience, making sure that happy developers have all of the DevX they want, that we have a huge performance focus right now. You'll have to watch the benchmarking pages over the next release. You'll see some really cool results from some of the new stuff that's coming out. And then overall health, both from the changes happening and overall health of the framework, but also health within our team. We're actually very concerned about making sure people are not burning themselves out, that we're not working too hard, working too fast. I love that about our team. It's a really tight-knit group, and we care about each other a lot. Some areas we're researching right now, progressive hydration, which comes with that really solid foundation that we built. That's something we see as really within reach with our deferred loading primitive and our hydration. Resumability, you may have heard this term. If you've seen anything from the Quick framework, they kind of coined this term. But what's really interesting about resumability is that I mentioned the Wiz framework at Google earlier, and the Wiz framework's been around longer than Angular, and it's actually the original resumable framework. So we've been learning a lot with our collaboration from them, so we're really excited about the prospects of what this will bring for Angular in the future. HTTP streaming is something people are interested in, WebAssembly, and so much more. And you may be wondering, Jessica, don't you want Angular to be the leading framework that everybody is using and no other frameworks out there should ever exist? Why are you doing all this collaboration? Because doesn't it benefit them too? And the truth is, we want you to be happy with whatever framework you're using, whatever it is, whether it's Angular, whether it's React, Vue, Svelte, whatever. The truth is, we want to make the web better for everyone. That's why we do this collaboration. So that's all I have, but before I go, there's some important things to say. Just a reminder to all of you that you're loved, you are capable people, and if you're struggling, know that you're not alone. And also, know that you have all of these resources available to you if you need them. You're welcome to scan that QR code. That'll take you to a link tree that has all this information as well. My name is Jessica Janiuk. I'm a senior software engineer on the Angular framework team. All of my socials are here. I'm on Mastodon, Threads, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, pretty much all the things except for Twitter. And thank you, and live long and prosper, everyone.
That was wonderful. Please join me on the question couch.
Of course.
So, first, I feel like we got to ask this question right out of the gate. If you yourself were a framework, which one would you be and why?
That is a really good question. I don't know, maybe with my interest in Star Wars, it might be Android.
Okay, and we're done. If you were starting a new web app today, what would be the primary reasons to choose Angular over other frameworks? So where is it going to shine as a framework choice?
That's a really good question. So I guess it depends on your use case, because Angular is going to shine in that it's guaranteed to be supported by Google. Mm-hmm. And that we have this promise of not breaking people and making sure that it's constantly stable. It's why a lot of fintech space and banks and stuff use us, because they know that it's not going to break. But for me, I'm just excited about all the stuff we're doing, all of the new features. I really am excited to use the defer primitive, not just because I had a hand in designing it and building it, but because I genuinely think it's a really good API for it. And I think people are going to love it. So to me, part of the reason is just the excitement around it right now, and the direction we're going. So I think that's why I would say Angular's good right now.
This actually is a good dovetail into a question that I have about, you mentioned Angular's renaissance. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty hard to deny that it feels different talking about Angular today than it did even a couple of years ago.
Yep.
What do you think shifted? Was it a cultural shift? Was it a technology shift? What changed that made us feel differently about Angular than we did even a couple of years ago?
Well, I made mention of this in the talk, but I joined the team. No, I really think that part of it is that we spent so much time trying to land our rendering engine. The Ivy process took years, literal years. The whole first year I was on the Angular team, we were working on landing that still. And that was kind of holding us back in a lot of ways. And once that landed, like we had all these, like we were saying to our community, like once Ivy lands, it's going to enable a whole bunch of stuff. And the awesomeness is that we've actually shown that to be true because I guess in that time we've also had some like new people join the team, and there's just a lot of new excitement and interest about like the things that we can do. And I think that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, I think I would also add, I think it's been so cool to see Angular collaborating, which I felt like, I think a lot of people felt that maybe Angular was sort of held apart as like, this is the Google project and then there's the web community.
Yeah.
Now it feels like Angular's in the web community, and that's pretty awesome.
And let me tell you, we're aware of that because for a long time, we only showed up at Angular conferences and didn't really go to anything else, and that has changed. And I think that's a big part of it too.
So technically, the industry is kind of making a shift right now to server-side rendering. We're seeing the pendulum swing back.
Yep.
How do you feel about this shift to SSR, and are you worried that this is going to be something that we're all scrambling to undo once we switch back to client-side rendering in a few years?
That's funny. I don't know that I am like, it makes sense. Like watching this space, it makes sense why, like we have spent all this time with these client-side frameworks because the DevX is great. And people want to be able to do all that work in one language. So that's why you see like the Node.js backends and the client-side front ends. But it's not surprising to me that the server-side rendering part comes in because we've seen the impact of shipping all of this JavaScript, all these giant bundle sizes. It actually does have a negative impact on the user space. So people wanting to leverage the server, which is going to be faster than your client because you can't guarantee the performance of what the end user is using. They might be running like, an Android phone from 5 years ago. They might be running the latest iPhone. They might be running like a 386 Compact. Who knows? I don't know how they would be able to access the internet with that. But you can't guarantee how it's going to perform in their browser. So wanting to leverage a more consistent space for getting the right user experience and getting it quickly makes sense to me. So like I've actually been a fan of server-side rendering since I started working with Angular, which was when Angular 2 released. I actually made my personal app server-side rendered. So it's something that's been a passion of mine. I'm eager to see more of it.
Great. So this is an excellent question from the audience. So when you're using other frameworks for comparison, like now that you're doing all this collaboration, how do you balance not becoming another Me Too framework and everything comes out the same, and not being different just for the sake of being different?
That is a really, really good question. And it's something that we actually think about on the framework a lot. Like there's been debates back and forth. Do we support TSX? Do we not? If we do that, are people just going to say, oh, it's just React with a fancy wrapper? Same thing with the svelte syntax. Are we just like copying other people? And the truth is, like, we all take from each other. Like every framework has done that. And you'll hear more about that tomorrow with Emma Twersky's talk. We have all picked and chosen the things that we like from each framework and brought them into our own. So it happens across all of the frameworks. So I guess we don't feel too guilty about it. And we feel that Angular is still unique enough that we can take what we like and put our own spin on that feature. For example, the defer primitive, it has a lot of similar features, but it's very much an Angular. Like if you look at it, it's very much an Angular API. So I think that's really how we approach it. We actually look at the frameworks, we play with them, and we're like, I really like this. I really don't like this. And what's fun also is seeing the different preferences across the team, because you'll have one person who's like, I really don't like working with React, and another person who's like, I love this. So it makes for really fun discussions when we're looking at new feature sets.
So a follow-on question to that is, do you think collaboration is incredible, and I love how much we're seeing, and we talked about this last year at JamstackConf on that panel.
Yep.
Do you worry that we're headed towards some kind of JavaScript singularity where all the frameworks have converged so much that there's not really differentiation anymore?
I mean, that could happen. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. If it does,
Do you think it would be a good or a bad thing?
that's a good question. I actually don't think it's going to happen because needs are constantly changing. Technology is constantly changing. And I think as some of these frameworks do have a little bit of convergence with them, we'll see other needs and other frameworks pop up to meet those needs. So I think we're going to continually be evolving into whatever the web is going to need in the future.
So you mentioned a lot of in-flight projects or features that are underway on Angular. How big is your team, and how are these projects happening in parallel? Are they sort of planned, but you're knocking them out one at a time? How do you manage work?
Well, yeah, there's a lot that's in flight, but only when we have Wi-Fi on the flight. You'd be surprised to learn that the Angular team is not huge. The framework team itself is 6 people. So we kind of have to pick and choose what our priorities are. Beyond the framework team, we actually have several sub-teams. So there's about 30 people overall that work on Angular specifically. We've got a sub-team for just the material components, and that's all they work on. We've got a sub-team for tooling that supports things like our CLI. And then we've got a dev infra team that helps us release our code. They do incredible work. We're very grateful that they exist. And then we've got our main framework team, as well as our DevRel. So it's a small group, and we have a lot we want to do. So we have to essentially have a priority list and do really solid assessments on what we can actually accomplish and deliver, understand what our users want, understand what the web space wants, and then we have to kind of go from there. So there's a lot of things in process, and we know that some of those things may be years out, and we slowly work towards them. So in some cases, we try to leverage other teams. We actually work with the Chrome Aurora team pretty regularly, and they've helped us with some signals-based stuff as well as some hydration-based stuff. We've worked, we've had meetings with outside of Google, like the photo I posted, and then the Wiz team. We actually have regular conversations because we are both working on this signals implementation together. We are very excited about that. So that signals library is used a lot in Google. And this just makes it better for us, but that means we can kind of leverage other people sometimes to do a little bit of our bidding, which is great.
Great. So you talked a little bit about how you manage decision-making for Angular, and one of the things you brought up was backward compatibility. Are you going to break people? Inevitably, as you're shipping things, there's going to be some amount of breakage. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate that? And especially, how do you navigate the sort of backlash that comes from breaking somebody's code?
Well, sometimes it's we actually have to fix it ourselves. So, as I mentioned in Google, we have a mono repo, and if we land a piece of code that breaks someone, we have to fix that code. So the short answer is we don't break people. But in the case that we have to, we have a whole year-long deprecation cycle, 2 major versions. So we'll announce that we're deprecating something for a long time. The whole migration thing is critical. It's only in the case where we can't migrate that it becomes a problem, and how we're going to deal with that. The components team has actually had to deal with a lot of that because when you change a web component of any use, people are relying on certain HTML structures to be there, and if you change that structure, you're going to break everybody. That is not fun. And so we have to be very careful, is really all it comes down to. Sometimes we actually say no to a change because it's just too breaky. Even if it would be really great to have, it's just too hard to land. So.
Got it. So this one might be spicy, so feel free to take a pass. But is there a feature that other frameworks are pushing for or starting to adopt that you or the Angular team is against or really nervous about in terms of what it would imply for users of the framework?
I don't think so. I don't think anybody's really looking at these frameworks and going, no, bad. There are some aspects of, like, we've looked at like the resumable case, and there is some concern about the size of some of the it's not index files. I can't think of it. There's a file that has all of your chunks in it, and it can get pretty big,
right.
Which we know is something that they'll probably optimize over time. But we're not really looking at that as like bad. We're more looking at it as, okay, if we go this route, we'll need to think about a way that's optimal.
Got it. So why don't we, maybe a follow-up to that, but like resumability is a bit of a hot topic. There's a lot of excitement about that. For you personally, like what, you mentioned the, what is that, the manifest file?
Yeah, that was it, the manifest file, yes.
So that's one concern. What are your feelings on resumability in general?
I think it's a cool concept. I've been real interested in learning more about it, and we have spent a lot of time doing research. I've actually given internal talks about it to our own team so that everybody kind of has the same understanding. And for those that don't really know what the concept of resumability is, it's essentially like a framework that renders on the server and then doesn't really ship as much JavaScript, but really the concept is that it like your client picks up where the server left off. So you have a really fast load time, and then it kind of piecemeal loads the JavaScript as it's needed. And there's pros and cons to it. Yeah, so I think it's really cool as a concept of shipping as little JavaScript as you can. I think there's probably a sweet spot rather than no JavaScript that would meet everybody's needs and still have the best performance. Because DevX becomes a challenge with it.
Right.
It is a huge DevX challenge to figure out how you're going to separate all of that code and make it work. So that's the biggest concern we have. Absolutely.
All right, we've got time for one more question here. So I am going to ask you a tough one.
Okay.
What is your favorite Star Wars character and
why?
My
favorite Star Wars character? That is a really tough question.
You have to pick one.
Well, I mean, I gotta say right now it's probably Ahsoka. Ahsoka Tano. I think she's just kick-ass.
Is everybody watching that show?
One person, okay. For those that don't know, Ahsoka Tano is Anakin Skywalker's apprentice during the Clone Wars, and she is phenomenal. So if you are interested in such things, definitely Clone Wars, Rebels, Ahsoka series. So.
That catalog is deep on the Star Wars universe.
Don't even get me started on Star Trek.
Oh, geez.
That's got an even bigger back catalog.
I'll say, relevant. Somebody in the audience asked if my hat was a Star Trek hat. It is not. It's an Astro hat. Mm-hmm. But I'd wear a Star Trek hat. I just don't have one. I think that's all we've got. That's all we got time for. Jessica, thank you so much. One more round of applause for Jessica. And with that, we are going to break for lunch. We have 60 minutes. Lunch is on your own today. There are a lot of great restaurants around the area, so grab the map, check it out, ask a local. Make sure you stop by and see the booths on your way out, and we will see you back here in 1 hour.